It's fourth of July, 57, 86 months, May 20. Sixty-one creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava, 36, 31, and 30, Seth, son of Adam, was born, 35, 26, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born, 34, 36, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born, 95, Mahalalel, son of Kenan, 33, 60, Yared, son of Mahalalel, was born, 31, 39, 622, Chanak, son of Yared, was born. No one's for sure. Ella Dibra Elohim Chaim, but this is the Missouri. Rikadadana Elohim Melaka Olam Mashirka Janaba Tzibanu Al Safira God King of Limits and Kadas concerning the Omer to is 40 is 7. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. So as if you wait until the morning, when did you shut these animals? Yesterday. So it just became possible this morning. Forget about the fact that the animal left the way somebody goes. It's morning. The morning is called what? Late. You know. Forget about your exits. You know, there's sleeping over the country. And the other is bringing right up. So it says, why are you telling me that Hackles will get stuck? The limbo, it's Mishnah, when you break down the Mishnah, Hackles is stuck in home, it's Yotzei. It's not Yotzei, it's Lena, who's there overnight. Why? Because the only time you can break down the Mishnah is in the morning. So when you break down the Mishnah, by the time you break it down, you have a Hackles, but it's not before. So like that, so maybe a little cash together. That's right. That's right. Everybody knows that. Coffee, calling coffee. Hey, extent, but then you start tripping it.
Mysticism and Kabbalah is on just how, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of incredibly complex development. Prophet of Israel and to the rod. Of course, this series brings for deeper. It will also enable you to situate developments of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are usually as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia to reach a larger audience here on this Terra. If you want, you can find the entire Kabbalah over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in the list. If you find the Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic in occultist philosophy by joining Patreon. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's introduce and cover. But just as a recap from last time, what we handled was it's a little and Lurianic Kabbalah. And I always look back on how I handle Lurianic Kabbalah, and there's always a problem with teaching it. And the problem with teaching it goes like this: is that either you go too thin or you big. And I always either go too thin, and then sometimes I feel like I go too thick on Lurianic Kabbalah. I lose people. In even a very thin overview, I lose people really rapidly. It's just such a heavy amount of background knowledge in Kabbalah to really get a handle on it. And so there's just no right way of covering it without sort of doing an entire class on it. But last time, by the 15th century, Kabbalah is spreading. It's moving. It's moving not just within the Jewish community, but it's also moving outside the Jewish community. Especially Christians are picking up Kabbalah. They're doing their own kind of Christian club, taking Kabbalah from their hiring converted Jews to translate text from for them, folks like Resius and Flavius and Gradides. Christian Kabbalah becomes a part of this larger Renaissance of trying to mine older traditions for these perennial truths. Those older traditions for perennial truths is going to build up a philosophy that sometimes gets referred to as esotericism, Christian mysticism, specifically in the occult mode. And this form of Christian Kabbalah is going to eventually become a whole thing to itself. The Christians are going to kind of run with Kabbalah, they're going to adopt ideas from it, and eventually what's going to emerge is kind of what's sometimes referred to as the Hermetic Kabbalah, which is a form of Kabbalah that mixes occult ideas and becomes the groundwork for what now called Western esotericism. So, in many ways, it's a life of its own in the Christian world, and eventually becomes its own form of mysticism, completely independent of Judaism. The big point is to refresher back over to what we covered last time, because it's been a couple of weeks because it becomes boring. But the big idea in Lurianic Kabbalah is that Luria is going to really in on the mythological structure of reality. He's very concerned with how reality comes to be, how it is that God comes to be all of reality. This is a very pantheistic or pantheistic, whatever shade of flavor of that you want to go with. But he's really concerned with the descent of the universe, how the universe comes into being, and he develops. Cordovera helps develop it for him, but the idea of the 4 or 5 worlds, depending on how you want to count them. Then you have these various levels of reality, and what ends up happening is at every level of reality, there are more spherot. You can get more and more spherot. If you ever come to the house, I can show you a book I have called the Ilan HaGadol, which is a kind of a map of reality according to the classic Lurianic take, where you have this enormously complicated system of spherot within spherot within spherot. So if you ever come to the house and you want to see this book, I'll pull it off the shelf and show you. But it becomes this incredibly Byzantine system of zero, but then zero very Baroque, I suppose you could say. But the big ideas, right, are this idea that God retracted some of God's self into a divine void. The divine void is filled with divine light, which shatters vessels inside of it, and this leads to a cosmic tragedy. And that cosmic tragedy is prepared, it's subject to tikkun, and the process of tikkun is accomplished by Jews basically maintaining the Torah, Jews maintaining strict observance to Jewish law, and by that strict observance of Jewish law, the metaphysical realities, various realities are prepared and under tikkun olam, and that paves the way for the Messiah. And so the messianic idea is going to be a big deal tonight. The messianic idea in Kabbalah begins to really heavily falter, and it becomes less the idea that God is picking someone to become the Messiah, and sort of thrown into as a sort of made Messiah. Messiah is something that you can become. That you become Messiah by becoming sufficiently righteous and sufficiently metaphysically able to manipulate reality in the interest of this tikkun process. And so we have a lot of ideas of exile and redemption in Lurianic Kabbalah that become very important in just a bit. And so what's going on in Lurianic Kabbalah is a radical renovation, systematization of Kabbalah as it's been inherited through the past several hundred years. Remember, the Sacred Zohar was only basically written down or published beginning in the 1270s, and that we're now in the late 16th century, and it's in the 16th century that Lurianic Kabbalah will come about. So it's been about 300 years since the development of the Kabbalah, and so 300 years is quite a long time, and it's in this 300-year period that Kabbalah really undergoes its major systematization. Also, its major systems theory, and that major system theory is the one of Itzhak Luria. Now, again, I just want to drive this point home. Itzhak Luria did not leave us a system. He left us a bunch of teachings to a bunch of students, and those students don't even agree about exactly what his teachings were. Chaim Vital, his most famous student, leaves us one system of teachings. His earlier student, Israel Saruk, who doesn't really get any press these days for whatever reason, but he published another system first. It's very time Vital. The question is, what is the real Lurianic Kabbalah? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what Luria taught. Luria didn't write much down, mostly just poetry and stuff. And so we actually don't have Luria's teaching. We have his students repeating his teachings many, many years. And so how much of that is a game of telephone? That's a good question. No. In fact, even the main body that presents Itzhak Luria's teachings that went on to become Lurianic Kabbalah, a book called Eitz Chaim by Chaim Vital, that book was never even intended for publication. Chaim Vital actually tried to hide it. And it was actually illicitly kind of stolen from him and then published without his consent. And so it's not even clear that that book is even meant to be a systematic representation of Luria's teachings. So it's a mess. It's just a mess. And so often people teach Kabbalah as the definitive Kabbalah. You go to the Kabbalah Center and you learn the Kabbalah. You learn this definitive. That's completely not possible. There are lots of different systems out there in historical record. They don't really agree. They don't at all. It seems to be a big exactly how it seems to happen. The degree to which when God consumes everything come out into the vacuum, everything pulled out of the stuff left behind. There is stuff left behind. What's left behind? It's just a bit of let's get into it. And what I want to two things. One thing is I'm going to be talking a little than what the slides are saying. So there's going to be a lot more information on the slides than what I say. So that's one thing that'll be importantly different about this talk than other talks. And the reason why that is there's so much information that I want to get out about Shabbat Tzvi, and that I can only put it in the slides. If I talk about all of this, I would just be here all night. So there's a lot more information on the slides than is on that I'll be talking about, but I want to make sure the slides are there. So if you want to read the slides as I go, you'll want more information from there. So that's the main thing about sort of the general flow. So typically, as I talked about, you'll be missing a lot of it by not looking at the slides. You do you. So tonight we're going to talk about Judaism is full of failed messiahs. We have lots of failed messiahs. We have Shakespeare, we have Shimon Bar Kokhba, we have Judas, we have a lot of different failed messiahs. What is Messiah? What is this concept of Mashiach? What is it Messiah? The idea developed primarily in the Zoroastrian period, that is to say during the Persian period, under the sort of reign apocalyptic. And the idea does begin to appear late in the Tanakh, and it seems to be the idea of a kind of chosen person by God to some world historical thing. Now, in the Bible, it's not really clear what any of that is. In fact, the only person in the Bible to be referred to as a Messiah is actually King Cyrus, a Persian king. It's not even a guy. So the idea is God picked Cyrus to do this very historical thing, i.e. let the Jews return home. And that becomes grounds for the Bible to Messiah. He's the only person referred to as the Messiah in the entire Bible. So if you want to take the Bible for it, the only person referred to is a Persian king. Now, what ends up happening is that over time, the idea of Messiah evolves. And as it evolves and changes, there are a lot of debates among Jews about what it means. And to be clear about this, there's never been about what the Messiah is. This very day, debates about the Messiah go on. It's never been a settled idea in Judaism. Typically what's happened in Judaism, I think I mentioned this in a previous talk, is that people grab onto the Messiah, they want a person to be the Messiah, and they kind of backtrack their notion of Messiah onto that person. So you pick a person to be Messiah, and then you figure out what that means, and then you go to the Bible to prove that they are the Messiah. There is no ready-made theory of the Messiah out there. It just doesn't exist. Now, we'll talk about some rough kind of Judaism, but even they're pretty rough and ready. So, what ends up happening is the notion of Messiah becomes more and more canonical, becomes more and more mainstreamism. And by the Babylonian Talmud, there are long, protracted discussions about what Messiahs mean, what is it to be a Messiah. And even by then, by the 5th century in the Common Era, there's no agreement. So if you read Tractate Sanhedrin towards the very end, in the 90s of the decade, you'll see that there's a lot of debate about even what they thought the Messiah was, what the Messiah could do, how you recognize what's the Messiah's name. There's an enormous amount of debate about. By the Middle Ages, belief in the Messiah had become a dominant part of Judaism. In fact, it's one of Maimonides' 12 articles of faith. You're supposed to believe that the Messiah is going to come. You fervently believe this. This is one of the 12 articles of legend that makes a Jew, according to Maimonides. So there's the idea that you can believe the Messiah, but it's what exactly is what they're going to do. And it's not even clear this can be one. There's something in text in Jewish history that even claim that there are going to be two of them. One of them is a Messiah as a kind of military leader. Furthermore, there's the idea of Mashiach Lador, which is the notion that in every generation there is a sort of potential Messiah. That the Messiah is actually out there, and it's just a matter of them themselves, or getting activated, or God activates them, or somehow they get activated. And so the idea is the Messiah is out there. They're just a Messiah in potentia. They have to be made a Messiah in action. It's just that no one's been worthy of that task up till now. So what little do we know about what the Messiah will do? How do we know a false Messiah from a real Messiah? Well, the stakes are pretty high, and you can see when I go through this list in a second why Jews don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, because it's very clear that Jesus has not accomplished any of the things that make a Messiah, according to even the most general lists. This is true, by the way, not just of Jesus, but every Messiah. Every Messiah has to faith. And so some of the list of things that they are supposed to do are things like they have to be born in a Davidic bloodline, they should be related to the church. So every city in Israel that's been ruined over history has to be rebuilt. They have to construct a third temple. That's the thing they have to do. They have to be both king and high priest, and they have to live 1,000 years. One of the main problems with the Messiah is they tend to die. Show me one that's lived, above the age of 60. So they tend to die 1,000 years. They have to bring world peace, no big whoop. In fact, not only bring world peace, they have to bring peace to the point where not even the animals hurt each other anymore. So that it's world peace, the level of not even animals hunting each other anymore. They have to cause every nation in the world to worship the God of Israel. So everybody becomes.
This bread that comes off the table, there's no big deal. If a Kohen eats this bread, he's not eating the bread. Once the Kohen is not eating the bread, there's no meal. It's not considered touching.
The son of the most.
In
fact, almost all the literature overwhelmingly is going to be Messiah as a kind of military leader. Furthermore, there's the idea of Mashiach L'Dor, which is the notion that in every generation there is a sort of potential Messiah. That the Messiah is actually out there, and it's just a matter of them activating themselves, or getting activated, or God activates them, or somehow they get activated. And so the idea is the Messiah's out there. They're just a Messiah in potentia, but they have to be made a Messiah in actu. It's just that no one's been worthy of that task up till now. So what little do we know about what the Messiah will do? How do we know a false Messiah from a real Messiah? Well, the stakes are pretty high, and you can see when I go through this list, that's why Jews don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, because Jesus not any of the things that make a Messiah a Messiah, according to even the most general lists. This is true, by the way, not just of Jesus. It's true of every Messiah. Every Messiah has to fail. And so some of the list of things they are supposed to do are things like they have to be in a Davidic bloodline, they have to be related by blood to David, you have to trace your lineage back to David. They have to rebuild all the ruined cities of Israel. So every city in Israel that's been ruined over history has to be rebuilt. They have to construct a third temple. That's the thing that they have to do. They have to be both king and high priest. And they have to live 1,000 years. Well, one of the main problems with Messiah is that everyone has lived, age of 60. So they live 1,000 years. They have to bring peace, no big whoop. In fact, not only bring world peace to the point where not even the animals fight each other anymore. That it's world peace level of not even animals fight each other anymore. They have to cause everybody becomes kind of Jewish. They resurrect and judge the dead, or at least they judge the dead. Maybe don't resurrect them, but they judge them. In fact, they judge them by smell, which is weird. The Messiah is said to smell and judge. They can know your sin by smell alone. It's sort of like a sin sommelier. They stop all illness. They stop all death. They stop all sadness, hunger, and strife. All the Jews to immigrate, establish a Jewish kingdom, was stretched from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates. Sometimes referred to as Israel. That's the bare minimum. Just to be clear, this is the bare minimum. There are all kinds of other things the Messiah is expected to do. This is minimum, right? That they have to do to even be a candidate. Now, as you can tell, no person who's ever lived has ever done any one of these things, much less all of them. Now, according to the Christians, Jesus will come back and do all this stuff later, but, well, they've been waiting for 2,000 years, and this guy hasn't showed back up. So, at any rate, these are the sort of the general outlines of what we think of when we think of Messiah in Jewish theology. Of course, it's much more complicated than this, but typically, these are the bare bones things that make a Messiah. A Messiah, and the reason I'm speaking from. Now, when we go back in time to the world that's going to produce this false Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, there's a couple different things that are going to be important about the historical and cultural context. So I want to go through those relatively briefly. The first thing in the church world is that rational philosophy has lost the fight to Kabbalah. That's one. There is no more Maimonideanism, not much in the way of Judaism. Rational Judaism has gone out the window. And what's increasingly taken over at this point is a turn toward Kabbalah. Now, it's not to say that Kabbalah is spread very far and wide. It certainly is the dominant intellectual movement of the time. Most of the intellectuals are either going straight into legal stuff via the Talmud, or they are doing that in Kabbalah. But philosophy, for the most part, is just not a big part of the equation anymore. And so in some ways, it may just be an unchecked kind of enthusiasm around Kabbalah. The second thing that makes all this very important is the Alhambra decree. Of course, the Alhambra Decree was a complete disaster for the Sephardic Jewish world in 1492, where all the Jews were basically rejected from Spain, and eventually rejected from Portugal as well. Rejection did two things. One, it heightened Messianic expectations. People really thought that this was the end of the world, because it was the end of their world. And the idea was that because it was the end of their world, perhaps God would intervene and save them. But how could God just let all these hundreds of thousands of people be kicked out of their homelands in Spain? God would intervene and fix it. Well, God didn't fix it, because that typically doesn't happen. What ends up happening is that people end up converting. They converted in mass, probably about the hundreds of thousands that converted to Christianity. And what ended up happening is that they converted to Christianity and then eventually left and began to be Jewish again. Now, what ends up happening in some of these converso communities is really important. Is a couple of things that I want to go through relatively briefly. There's an intense feeling of exile. They are experiencing exile, the deported, both their exile from their homeland, like Spain, and they are destined, they are really wanting to return. A big part of this is not Florian Kabbalah, and Kabbalah more generally is a kind of exile restoration motif. Secondly, there's just sort of an apocalyptic flair in Europe generally. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But in the 1600s and the 17th century, apocalypticism, the idea the world was about to end, was just an overwhelming cultural aspect of what was going on in Europe at the time, both with Christians and with Jews. One of the things that's also important about this is a shift in converso communities, because they were more in contact with Christianity. They've been basically practicing Christianity and learning Christianity for quite some time now, it's a generation or two, is that what a Messiah was much more open to the idea of a spiritual Messiah, or didn't do all the political stuff. Now, the political aspect of the Messiah is essential to the notion of Messiah Judaism. There's just no such thing as a spiritual Messiah in Judaism. Messiah in Judaism is always a political entity. They're always a king and a high priest. They always change the world in concrete, this worldly manners. Well, the Christian idea of Messiah isn't that. The Christian idea of Messiah is Jesus did not fix the world, Jesus fixed sin. And because Jesus fixed sin, it's completely invisible, and the political world keeps on keeping on until Jesus back. Well, the idea that these conversos came in contact with more spiritual life are open to non-traditional ideas of Messiah more generally. You see this in the chapter spaces. They were also open to the idea that of what we might call theologianism, which is just to say that they were told the idea that Judaism had been Christianity had come along and corrected all the errors of Judaism, and that Christianity was the superseding corrected religion, and that Judaism was outmoded. What's important about that is the idea that Judaism in some ways can be replaced. So they're going to convert back to Judaism, they're going to revert back to Judaism. They're going to be much more interested in the idea that the fundamental things about Judaism can be changed. Traditional Jewish communities would not be open to that idea. Many of the converso communities, many of the converso people would be open to it. And also, they're going to be much more open to what we call antinomian tendencies, which is just to say that for a traditional Jewish community, the Jewish law, observance of the Sabbath, observance of certain Jewish law are just not questionable. They're not up for grabs. We're not stuck in the world of the 23. The traditional Jewish world is very clear. You cannot abandon any aspect of Judaism. You can't negotiate with it. You have to do it or not do it. It's not a grab. But for these converso communities, there's much more of the idea that you could by the law. But the law is not immutable. But the law is something that can be read as a metaphor, or it can be read as a way that can be changed. That one could alter Jewish law in the interest of an idea that's completely foreign to traditional Jewish ideas, but very much in the strain of those who have been exposed to Christianity. Further, the situation in Europe is just such that, in general, people expected a kind of apocalypse. That was just in the air in the 17th century. Christians, Jews, Muslims, basically everybody thought the world was about to end in a very, very intense way. Comets started appearing, all kinds of weird stuff was happening, and people were really convinced all about the end. Further, we also have printing that's taken off. Now, printing is one of these things that disseminates ideas very, very rapidly. And that's one of the great things about printing. You can also disseminate ideas that are incorrect very rapidly. One example of this Jews returned in Saudi Arabia. They returned to Arabia. They had amassed a giant army led by this general, and that the 10 tribes of Israel had destroyed, had conquered Islam. This idea is completely nuts. It's not grounded in any history at all. They were repeated broadsheets printed through Europe. One really did believe that the 10 tribes of Europe were literally about to reconquer Israel and bring about the end of the world. This was a very common idea. So these kind of dissemination of bonkers notions were very, very popular. Not just that, there's all kinds of things going on in Europe that led to the complete world was about to undergo some big change. Columbus's discovery of the so-called New World. There were the ongoing religious wars of the Hundred Years' War, the Protestant Reformation. There was tons of talk about the Antichrist. Everybody was the Antichrist. The Protestants thought the Pope was the Antichrist. The Pope thought Martin Luther was the Antichrist. There's the witch trials. There are all kinds of things going on. If you want to get an idea about most folks have heard of Michel de Nostradamus, right? The Nostradamus is famous is quatrain, prophetic quatrains. He dies in 1566. It's around he's living in roughly this time. So what's going on here is that the entire world is basically expecting a messianic or apocalyptic event. And so in some ways, had it not been Shabbatai Tzvi, it'd have been somebody else. I really am convinced of that. It just happened to be Shabbatai Tzvi. Also, there's a huge massacre in Poland that kills thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. In fact, the Kaminsky pogrom or Kaminsky uprising may have been the largest single killing of Jews prior to the Holocaust, which also occurred in Poland. And there was this massive killing, maybe up to 100,000 Jews. We're not sure how many died, but it was probably the largest mass killing of Jews until the Holocaust. And also, again, we have this expectation that emerges in the aftermath of this situation that we meet Shabbatai. Shabbatai was born into a mercantile family on Tish B'Av and on Shabbat. That's why it's called Shabbatai. It's not uncommon for, it wasn't uncommon then at least, for people born on Shabbat to be named Shabbatai. Honor people born on Shabbat. Now no one calls their kids Shabbatai anymore because of how bad Shabbatai Tzvi's reputation has become. But he's also born on Tish B'Av. You may know this, that on Tish B'Av it's a custom in ViralRabbi, Midrash, that the Messiah was born on Tish B'Av. As you probably know, Tish B'Av is the Saturday. It's the day of mourning. Temples destroyed, and World War I started, and all kinds of bad things. Of course, on ghetto uprising and crush. All kinds of bad things happen on Tish B'Av. It's a day of mourning. Well, the idea from ViralRabbi is that the Messiah will be born on Tish B'Av. It will convert the day of mourning into a day of celebration. So already we have Shabbatai being born on just the right day, and not just being born on Tish B'Av, but also being born on Shabbat. And this is already an auspicious start here in 1626 in Izmir. Izmir, as you may know, is the site of ancient Ephesus. So I've been to Izmir. It's the site of ancient Ephesus. By the 1640s, as Shabbatai is growing a little older, he begins to engage in some pretty strange practices already. He's not involved in the mercantile practices of his family. He begins to turn his attention to ascetic practices. And he begins to drown himself, I would say, in reading the Sefer Zohar and the Sefer HaKanah. The Sefer HaKanah is a book where a questions a teacher about the various laws, and the teacher tells the student why we do the laws the way that we do. The law is going to be a big part of Shabbatai's life, as we'll see in just a bit. So it's around this time that Shabbatai, when around his teens, that he has this vision of this experience of his penis being damaged by a demon. It's not clear exactly what happened, but sexual issues plague Shabbatai his entire life. And so the idea that he's being afflicted by the demoness Na'amah, who was a demoness in the Zohar, you may know her better, that's the name of Noah's wife, actually. But this demoness Na'amah, who we find in the Zohar, is said to have done something to Shabbatai's penis and causes him all kinds of problems. And it's around this time in his teenage years, he also begins to experience these periods what he calls illumination. And these will last for a period of darkness, when he's in bed, and everything's worst, everything's terrible. So he's probably suffering. Most psychologists I've talked to diagnose him after his death, of course, as something like manic depression. But he also, at the same time, he's been now he can do supernatural things like levitate in front of his friends. His friend said that he really did love it, and then he told them that he used to see him as they were righteous enough, they were pure enough. But he really did love it, according to Shabbatai. His family tries to fix it by marrying him off, which is the common solution for things back in the day. Just get married and things will get better. Shabbatai refused to consummate either marriage. He just basically would not have sex with these women. And these women complained that Shabbatai was basically studying the Zohar all the time. These illuminations and darkness fits, he wouldn't have sex with them, and his marriage would dissolve. And of course, as you imagine, this is a huge problem for his family. It's a huge embarrassment for his family, but he just refuses to have sex with these women for whatever reason, and they divorce him. And so he's twice divorced by the summer of 1648. And on June 11th, 1648, he has a vision of Prophet Elijah coming to him and telling him that he was the Messiah, basically anointing him and making him into the Messiah. And we're told that he began to exude fragrance from his body. So this is a thing that's commonly talked about Shabbatai Tzvi, is that he smelled really good. He had this intense fragrance coming off his body constantly. And so he told some of his close friends and his family that he was the Messiah. I don't know how they responded to this, but typically he kept it pretty secret. In the aftermath of him thinking he was the Messiah, even though secretly by 1651, Shabbatai is kicked out of his home. He is exiled from his homeland. He's kicked out for reasons that aren't terribly clear exactly. But one of the things that we do know that he was doing at this time was that during prayers he was enunciating the divine name of God during prayer. This is a no-no in Judaism. You're not allowed to say God's name, and Shabbatai was doing this in prayer, along with some other strange things he was up to, and this eventually led to him being kicked out of the community of Izmir. He'll come back with the vengeance. The period that he's roaming around is typically referred to as the years of darkness by the community of folks who believe in Shabbatai Tzvi. The period of the years of darkness has him traveling around all through the Mediterranean world. We don't know his exact itinerary, but we know he traveled all around Egypt and the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean basin, and he did some strange things. He would settle in the really heavily Kabbalistic city of Salonika, and what is now Greece, and there he publicly married the Torah scroll. That also was not a thing you should do. That got him kicked out of Salonika. He seems to have made a pretty strong impression on people as he traveled. Now, making a strong impression is not making a good impression, and so he often made a bad impression on people because they thought he was crazy, or maybe he was a prophet, or a Kabbalist, or whatever. But he made an impression on people no matter where he went, and eventually he settles in Cairo, where he comes into the family very wealthy leader of the Jewish community, and it's there that Shabbatai actually got a job being basically a fundraiser. What he would do is he would go to Jerusalem and he would raise money for the community there. The community in Jerusalem was mentioned before, and what he would do is go back and forth raising money from from local folks trying to Jerusalem to get back online. On one of these missions, raising back in Cairo, that an orphan from the massacres that I mentioned in Poland earlier actually had arrived in Cairo, and she was a piece of work herself. She was a pretty famous sex worker, and she was a former orphan that had been orphaned by the massacres in Poland, and she went through places like Livorno and Amsterdam, where she eventually made her way to Cairo, and she made her name as a pretty famous sex worker, something like a not exactly a courtesan, but famous sex. And when Shabbatai was in Cairo, he actually heard about her reputation, and one of the things that she claimed was that she would marry the Messiah. That was her big claim to fame, is that she would marry the Messiah, and Shabbatai was the fact of the Messiah. This is the second time he sent and he did this probably as part of his messianic buildup, because as you may know, the prophet Hosea also married a sex worker as a sign of his prophecy that he was having this sex worker. And what's interesting is it didn't go to him until she died. She was with him all the way in his very tumultuous life, as we'll see. She died in 1674, and they were divorced briefly. But they were together for basically their entire adult life. They're on the way back to Jerusalem, but on the way to Jerusalem, he stops in Gaza. He stops in Gaza because he wants to meet a young and up-and-coming Kabbalist. That young and up-and-coming Kabbalist is a 23-year-old Nathan Ben Elisha Chaim Halevi Ashkenaz. Nut of Gaza is probably one of the leading up-and-coming Kabbalist minds at the time. From writings, we can see that he understands not just Kabbalah in general, but he also even understands really higher level debates that are going outside of Kabbalah. He even knows that there are specific schools of Kabbalah, and Nathan of Gaza is actually wading into the waters of the really technical Kabbalah development. Now, what ends up happening is also himself not a mystic but a prophet, and he's having visions. He begins having visions as a young man, and these visions are such that he becomes kind of a mystical healer. Now, that idea of a mystical healer isn't completely foreign to Judaism. We actually see the same idea, for instance, in Luria. Luria is a physician of the soul, as I sometimes refer to. And there's the idea that people like Luria and Nathan of Gaza can cure spiritual diseases that you have by diagnosing those spiritual diseases and by giving you a tikkun or a cure, a reparation, and that cure will fix it will solve your spiritual problems. And so it seems like ends up happening is that Shabbatai's feet travels to Gaza to meet with Nathan to become cured of his what we might call manic depression, silent darkness. What's happening is that he ends up traveling to Gaza. He stays with Nathan for several, and in the several weeks they walk from Gaza to Jerusalem, which is a quite long walk, and they also walk from Jerusalem to Hebron, and that baptizes the Messiah. He lays it on Shabbatai. He's like, not only can I not cure you, but you don't need to be cured. You're the Messiah. And he seems to be in one of his dark periods of this in this whole business. What ends up happening eventually is that Nathan eventually announces the entire Shabbatai is the Messiah business, and near Shavuot 1665, and Nathan is possessed by this Magid spirit. This is all incredibly weird. And eventually, what ends up happening is that Shabbatai is experiencing a profound one of these depression periods, and then 3 days later declares that he is for the Messiah is nothing new in Judaism. People every once in a while come along and say they're the Messiah. And what typically happens is that no one believes them, or very few people believe them. That's typically what ends up happening. Well, Shabbatai is in Gaza. He declares he is the Messiah, and he announces that the fast of the seventh does not observe the fast, and rather than observe the fast, he announces that that Hallel should be said. Hallel is what you say for we abolished it. The days of the Messiah are here. The days of fast. And he takes at this point he has about 40 followers. He takes them from himself. The Messiah in Jerusalem. He said, "I am the Messiah." He tries to get on top of the Temple Mount to perform a sacrifice, basically to try to inaugurate the reality of the temple. He also begins to refer to himself as the Amirah, Adonenu Malkeinu Yaram Hodo, and the Jerusalem community stops him. They're like, "You're nuts. You're crazy. You cannot go on the Temple Mount. There's a mosque up there. If you go up there where there's a mosque up there and try to kill an animal, like you're gonna get the local rabbi that you turn into the local Qadi. Qadi is basically the Turkish mayor of Jerusalem, and they turn him over to the Qadi, and they say, "This guy's crazy. You need to arrest him." Not only does he not arrest him, he allows Shabbatai to go around on horseback around the city, waving a green banner. Now, on a horse, ride on horses, for Jews to ride on horses, that was the exclusive purview of Muslims. But for whatever reason, the Qadi of Jerusalem just probably circle around Jerusalem, waving this green banner 7 times, and this is proof for Shabbatai's followers that he's actually important. So he's actually the Messiah, because he is able to basically not get arrested by the local Qadi, and he is allowed to circle the city on horseback 7 times, so summoning up some Jericho imagery. Further, he allows his followers to eat forbidden food, certain parts of the animal, which the Bible declares to be unkosher. He says to his followers they're allowed to do. These violations of Jewish law, he even develops, has a special blessing for violating Jewish law on purpose. And eventually the rabbi send a complaint against Shabbatai all the way to the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul. Well, what ends up happening, Shabbatai is run out of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem community, which previously used to singing. He's a very singer and very charismatic. They run him out of Jerusalem, and what happening, Shabbatai departs for what happens is that he's already sent letters ahead of Shabbatai to the folks in Aleppo, specifically letters explaining using very complex codification, the Tree of Dragons, and other kinds of documents, that Shabbatai is in fact the Messiah, and they welcome him as the Messiah. Well, it's not clear exactly how and why Nathan of Gaza wrote it, but they were clearly convinced of him, because when he arrived in Aleppo, it is a fanfare to take the parade for Shabbatai to be. He's welcome. He's openly for 3 weeks, and it is a complete wave of enthusiasm. There are people prophesying in the streets that the Messiah has come. He basically converts much of the of Aleppo, most of the Jewish community of Aleppo, to him. He basically converts them to Messianism, and he gets perhaps one of his most important allies at this time, and that is important ally is the son of the person, one of the main people responsible for the Messiah or for the Kabbalah. He's been dead now, but his son is living in Aleppo, and his son declares that Shabbatai is the Messiah. So it's like having a son of the worst Kabbalists of all time, basically declaring that this guy's the Messiah in Aleppo. It is a huge explosion in enthusiasm that he received in Aleppo. After spending 22 days like a Gaza feverish, writing letters and feverish track, prayer books, and prophecies, he's sending these all the Jewish world, and you could not ask for a better Gaza. And Nathan is sending this stuff to everybody, getting it. People are getting very excited about the things that Shabbatai can do allegedly, and what is happening is that Shabbatai makes his way home here. As soon as he gets there, well, he falls into depression. He falls into depression for weeks, and it's not until of that year that he emerges, and it's around this time that the excommunication basically, or gets communication, and sometime around Hanukkah of that year, there is an explosion of tension. There are the pro-Shabbatai people and the anti-Shabbatai people, and what ends up happening is the anti-Shabbatai guy actually is leading prayers on, and literally Shabbatai grabs an axe and hacks his way on the Sabbath into the Portuguese synagogue. He says the other rabbi out of the building. He says he cleansed it of the evil forces that were inside the synagogue, and then he sets himself up as kind of a king inside the Portuguese synagogue after chasing the other rabbi out. Not only that, the guy who he chased out, the rabbi who he chased out, his own rabbi's daughters fall into prophetic hymns declaring Shabbatai to be the Messiah, getting from Messiah. He's being chased around by Shabbatai with an axe, and his own daughters are falling into these enthusiastic trances, declaring that Shabbatai is the Messiah. He does the same thing. He pronounces the divine name. There's all kinds of things that begin to go on. He sings Christian songs in the synagogue. He allows women to come in. There are just all the things he begins to do when he's back in his mirror that are raising rapidly of the local world. Last time also that he consummates his marriage with his wife. And he had not done that. It was the bloody proof that the marriage was consummated to great fanfare. And so all kinds of things happen here at Izmir that are special. Is really beginning to act out in various. So on December 30th, he set sails with some of his followers. The 30th of December is that in 1666, by early 1666, Nathan of Gaza's letters have reached everywhere. By the time he set sail, in early 1666. Even before he reaches London, Amsterdam, everybody increasingly thinks he's the Messiah. By 1666, by the summer of 1666, I become convinced he's the Messiah. With some places, like the Ham community, or the Universal community, basically having packed their bags, boats back to Israel, because they were convinced it was literally about to take our world. So that entire community packed bags, had them on the dock, and were waiting to go home back to Israel because Shabbatai had done the whole thing. So this was a overwhelming part of the Jewish community, at least half, maybe more. Even Spinoza weighed in about Shabbatai and stuff, but But sadly, we don't have this letter, so we don't know exactly what he was going on. Well, the trip from Izmir to Istanbul should only have taken a couple of weeks, but it took 39 days. They had very, very bad weather, and what ends up happening is coming to Istanbul gets ahead of him, and because it gets ahead of him, as soon as he arrives in Istanbul, he is the government knows what this guy is. They know he's coming there basically to declare his messiahdom in Istanbul, the capital of the empire. And the idea, I think, is he's just going to take over as the king of the Ottoman Empire. So he's arrested. He's been beaten up by one of the guards. And he's thrown in jail. The jail he's thrown into is the Tower of Strength, and he's put into captivity, but he's put into very luxurious captivity. His followers, which at this point amass probably in the thousands, enormous amounts of money to him. That allows him to basically bribe his guards, and he lives in. He's kind of like a king inside of this prison, basically. It's inside this prison that he sees emissaries from Yemen, from Europe, from all over. And it's in this prison situation in the Migdal Oz that he begins to basically hold court as if he were a king. He's dressed like a king, acts like a king, and he is doing all kinds of things while he is imprisoned here in the beginning of 1666. And he's receiving, like I said, emissaries from all over. And these emissaries really do believe that, despite the fact that he reveals that he really is the Messiah. So he's receiving emissaries from all over, and they are coming back and really preaching the gospel, so to speak, of Shabbatai Tzvi. It's at this time in 1666 that the Shabbatian movement 2 years. A hater basically ruined everything for him. This guy named Nehemiah Cohen arrives from Gallipoli, and he's heard about that Shabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah. He meets with them, and basically he's disillusioned. He thinks this guy's really not the Messiah, probably because Nehemiah Cohen thought he was the Messiah, and for Messiah beef. And he tells us, or at least the luxury thing is that on December 15th, re-arrested. He's drugged and assaulted the Grand. They interrogate him. They ask him if he's the Messiah. Right? Here's the test. I'll convert to your religion if you pass one test. And the test is this. We're going to strip you naked. We're going to bring in a bunch of archers. And they're going to shoot you with arrows. And if you survive, if the arrows bounce off of you, we'll all convert. And if not, well, you'll die. And they say, all right, Shabbatai, you're the Messiah. Right? Let's do this. And so, Shabbatai Fear probably says, nope, I'm not the Messiah, I'm just a rabbi. He does not want to be shot with a bunch of arrows. And so the vizier of the Ottoman Empire says, okay, Shabbatai, well, you have one option now. You can convert to Islam or you'll be impaled. Today, you have 5 minutes to decide. You can convert to Islam or you will be impaled. And Shabbatai, not being stupid, though he might have been crazy, converts. He converts to Islam. He's Ahmadiyya. And he converts on September 16th, 1666. Not only does he convert, the Sultan is actually pretty pleased with the fact that he converted, and he appoints him, basically, and because he becomes a ceremonial gatekeeper, he's actually an official member of the Sultanate court. And he gets him basically the only job ever. Gatekeepers were basically just cushy positions given to members of the court, and I could do basically whatever he wanted. So in many ways, he came out all the better, at least materially. I mean, obviously being shot through an arrow would have been really bad, or being impaled would have been really bad. But the vizier and the sultan really aren't out to get this guy. They basically just want him to go away as a problem. And so they give him the cushiest job they can and basically give him a pension. So hopefully he will just quit. Well, they're going to get themselves more and more trouble. Shabbatai's very lucky that he was not just shot through an arrow. I think had he not had a lot of wealthy friends, shish kebab on our hands. But he had a lot of wealthy friends, so he doesn't end up. So what ends up happening is that the first thing that happens is that news of his apostasy spreads all throughout the Jewish world. And this is really bad. This is really bad. Half the Jewish world thought the guy was the Messiah. They had packed their bags. They were already putting Shabbatai's feet in their prayers. The prayer book had been changed to include as the Messiah. And then this guy basically overtakes the Ottoman Empire, and the world's going to come to an end. They had packed their work literally on the docks. And waiting for news. And the news I got was, okay, we convert to like, yeah, you got 8 pastas.
All the people that are that it says that the rabbis and so you show that a woman can eat Torah. Why would I think the whole entire parish of Torah is like man, Zachar. That's the thing with rabbis and so you show. How do we even include it? But one of my already daughter, we add her, we say that she is actually on how do they know that a woman is too poor if they already used up money on this? That is in the fog of him. So if you're not saying what she doesn't only learn, but Russia from the fog. Some say, look at Mishnah, you're doing great here, no? Telling you this against Hakol Surfing. I love this. Everybody does sneak. Everybody besides everything. We like no one. Not the list. Why? I'll tell you what my first idea right off the bat. I call some quotes the Pharaoh should. This should take away 99% of society. I call something because the Pharaoh should. It's a death seal, right? Always. Pharaoh doesn't need death. Pharaoh needs death. So when the time of the court, they were literally considered they don't have deaths. You can't have money. There's a shayta, sasa. With this, you have to have the money. You have to be able to say, I am doing, I'm leaning on this. I'm doing the shabbat. And a blind man, and that's the sleep. Enough. And I don't work the evidence. Actually, slave, and a woman. Then says the Mishnah is smicha shyaret. The smicha is the leftovers of the mitzvah. What does it mean it's the leftovers? It's not ikr mitzvah. It's not ma'akim. So if you don't do smicha, you're okay. You don't have to bring another card. How do you do it? I'll roach, stay in time. 2 hands on the thing. I'll roach, stay in time. Smicha is the hands. So the Mishnah says 12 office. It actually pops up here as 12 office. You want to say that it's one on office. I just want to design on the testing as if it's Sabrella. For what? It's a plague. Maybe it is. It's one on one, but that comes up to see that. The same area where you use the smicha, you do the smicha. Take it, the smicha shmika. Notice over here in the puzzle, the Soma Yoda Rothschild, that's the beginning of the house. And right afterwards it says Shaka. So Smicha and Shika, they go one after the other, they follow each other. There shouldn't be any, basically, there shouldn't be a hefsek between. You have also like it's a lot of take the kilo broccoli, like you wash your hands, you say broccoli, there's a certain like, one after another. That kind of a logic. It says the more Mishnah Cherish and the Kaka, that's easy. I know, Cherish and the Kaka can't do sweet, but the last many babies need Kavana, they don't have Kavana. Rahinami, that I could guess, baby short circle, main going so. So I'm just going to steal from places over here, with all the bags, and the Pashas, the Gemara says that there's no sweet by women, because women isn't first. With the same concept. The name is wrong. The name is wrong, not places wrong. Okay. Hello, why is a blind man excluded from Simcha? Machloikis, Rav Chizda, Rabbi Rothschild, Chadon are actually because Simcha on the Zigna. I learned from the Sanhedrin by the parallel brother. And just like in the Sanhedrin, you can't be part of the Sanhedrin if the person's blind, that's wrong. You can't be part of the Sanhedrin. That's the God has to see. So clearly, so we learn Simcha that by Simcha also, the person can't be blind. So places on the base, I know I put it in the slide, but I can't find it out. We said, this is just it even says that it belongs on Amud Aleph. Sure. Yep. So it says,
Some Jewish people convert to Islam. So as you can imagine, that's bad. Not only is it bad, it's incredibly embarrassing. All the Christians just took it as more proof that the Jews are full of it. It's completely crazy Jewish people, stupid Jewish people can't understand anything. And not only that, the Jews who remain anti-Messiah, folks like Manasseh and Israel and Amsterdam, they were able to greatly close their grasp on the Messianic factions. So this was a disaster, a titanic disaster in the Jewish world. And it was it's probably one of the greatest intellectual disasters in Jewish history. Nathan wouldn't hear about the apostasy until the summer of 1666, or 1667 actually. He left Gaza and fled to, basically ran over to where he could basically find Shabbatai. And the big debate at this time was, what did the apostasy mean? Now, one thing that you know about Messiahs is that when Messiahs do terrible things like die or convert to another religion, it's not a problem, but it's all part of the plan. That's how delusions go. Delusions are never disproven. Delusions are only reinforced. No matter how ridiculous the delusion is. So, Shabbatai's apostasy was not apostasy. It was part of the plan. It was all part of the plan. Now, what happens here? Nathan of Gaza circulated a letter saying, no, this is part of the plan, don't freak out, don't lose faith. It's very important to maintain faith. So there are actually a couple of different theories that were going around at the time about what really happened. One theory, the craziest theory, is that somehow Shabbatai Tzvi really was now the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. There were some people that continued to believe that. That not only had he not converted, he was just now the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire somehow. Another way is that he had converted, but he converted in order to take power away from the Sultan. So yes, he was a Muslim, but only temporarily, because he was about to get power from the Sultan somehow. Who knows how that's supposed to work? The third reason was that he converted as part of a Kabbalistic plan to redeem the deepest, darkest levels of demonic power, the Klipot. And the reason why he converted was to descend into the apostasy of Islam, to redeem the Muslims and bring them along as part of the Kabbalistic plan. So his apostasy wasn't really apostasy, it was him sacrificing himself, a suffering servant, by plunging himself into the he would be able to somehow engage in a greater act of The fourth theory about what happened was that he had not really converted, but that the real Shabbatai had actually gone into heaven, and that what was left behind was a kind of illusion Shabbatai. So the real Shabbatai is in heaven or somewhere else. He's gone into the supernal realms as part of the grand act of redemption, and that the Shabbatai that had converted was a kind of illusion or a kind of shadow or something. So it really wasn't Shabbatai. So these are the big four theories that circulated about what happened when Shabbatai converted to Islam. It seems like Nathan of Gaza accepted some version of 3 and 4. He accepted some version of 3 and 4, more 3 than 4, but certainly he accepted 3. And his position was, yes, Shabbatai converted to Islam, but this was a temporary thing. That he would eventually redeem Islam, redeem the Muslims, and that he would emerge out of Islam back to Judaism, and he would emerge as having redeemed this fallen religion. Shabbatai, for all what it's worth, basically fell into a Titanic depression, as you can imagine. I mean, he basically just become an apostate. He fell into a deep depression. In fact, he wrote to his brother Elijah and said, "Hey, leave me alone. I'm a Turk now. I don't want to deal with the Jews. I'm done. I'm done." He plunged into a really, really, really deep depression. Nathan of Gaza never gave up the faith. In fact, to the end, he never gave it up. And so, not only does the Shabbatian movement not die in the aftermath of the 66 conversion, but Nathan of Gaza, the working of the myth actually caused it to flourish. It caused it to flourish. It calcified the new religion. One thing, let's see where we're at in terms of. So what I'll do, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to finish up that Tzvi, and then we'll do Nathan of Gaza, and then we'll do the Frank next time, because it gets crazier than chapter Tzvi. You can believe it. We'll do the Frankist Hasidism, which I'm sure my Hasidic people would absolutely hate, but they are connected in a weird way. At any rate, Ishmael Mordechai, is a fantastically Jewish Muslim name. It's Ishmael's the Islamic name, Mordechai is a Jewish name. And what ends up happening is that Shabbatai began to continue to live as the gatekeeper, this ceremonial position. He lives a kind of mixed life. He's sort of quasi-Jewish. He's Jewish under the cover of night, I suppose, but he's publicly living as a Muslim. And people continue to come to visit him, believing he's the Messiah. And they do believe that he's doing this business of raising the code of raising his act of apostasy is actually a Kabbalistic act of redemption. And so over time, it seems like Shabbatai Tzvi also begins to believe this as well. And again, Shabbatai also suffers from these deep depressions. This actually believes it at any given moment, but slowly it seems like Shabbatai does come around to the idea that he might actually still be the Messiah. Now, the Muslim leadership of the Ottoman Empire gets word of this. They don't like the idea that he's secretly still living as a Jew. And so what ends up happening is that the rabbis of Istanbul, the chief rabbis of Istanbul, are exhausted with Shabbatai continuing to basically hold court as a kind of quasi-Messiah. And on the 12th of September 1672, they go to the Pasha, which is a high-ranking member of the Ottoman court, and they basically tell him, this guy's not really a Muslim. Yeah, he's converted, but he's living as an apostate. He's not living as a Muslim. And not just that, but he's doing all kinds to what is now Montenegro. Basically, he's exiled to get away from all the Jews. They're kicking the Pasha came out anywhere. So they took him to the most obscure, one of the most inaccessible regions of the Ottoman Empire, basically to get him away from his Jewish world, his Jewish community. And it's there, in an even further exile, that his wife Sarah would die. He would take another wife, Aisha, and he would die alone in Montenegro in the year 1676. In fact, I think his brother visited him, and he asked, "How long are you going to hold on to me?" And he said famously, and this is a bit of obscure, he says, "Perhaps if you can see that rock on the coast." It was a really far away rock. But at any rate, on September 17th of the 1676, he dies during Ne'ilah of Yom Kippur. He dies at the gates. And Jewish act as Messiah, I suppose, was to request a Maxos and Yom Kippur prayer book so that he could say the prayers of Yom Kippur. And we're told that Shabbatai Tzvi, or the Amirah, or Aziz Mehmet Effendi and was praying Jewish prayers as he died on Yom Kippur near Ne'ilah. He was intentionally buried somewhere that no one could ever find him. The legend is that he was buried in a cave near the sea, and when his brother had come to visit him, there was a dragon actually guarding the mountain. Came back in the cave, the dragon was gone, it was full of light, Shabbatai's body was nowhere to be found. It was an empty tomb, very much like the Jesus story. The empty tomb of Shabbatai's feet, but he's ascended to heaven, or at least gone into occultation, and no one knows to this day, by the way, where Shabbatai's feet is buried. It's not clear at all what happened to his body. Of course, his body vanishing only adds to the idea that somehow he is hiding, he has become resurrected. Nathan of Gaza, his PR guy, continued to believe that Shabbatai was the Messiah all the way up to his death on January the 11th of 1680. Many years after Shabbatai died, he continued to write pro-Shabbatian tracts all the way to the end. He said that Shabbatai wasn't dead, that he was hidden, or that he had ascended into heaven, or he had transfigured somehow. And he died eventually in Skopje, in Macedonia. He's trying to live closer to Shabbatai Tzvi. And his grave, actually, until it was destroyed during the Second World War, was an object of veneration. Shabbatians continued to flock to his grave. Now, you would think that with Shabbatai dead and with Nathan of Gaza dead, that this entire movement, as bizarre as it is, would just peter out with both of these guys dead. In 1680, that should be the end of the Shabbatian movement. Well, if you thought that, you'd be dead wrong, because Shabbatianism is about to explode from a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand people, to tens of thousands of people. It's going to form a completely new religion. Shabbatianism is going to form a totally new religion. And that totally new religion is going to be led primarily by Shabbatai Tzvi's second wife, Aisha, or Yochebed. She had both names. So what we'll get to next time, we'll probably spend an entire other section on Shabbatianism, the rise of Shabbatianism, because there's so much to do. When that emerged in the aftermath of Shabbatai Tzvi. All the way, that is when the last we know of died. It's probably the case they survived after that. There were Shabbatians after the 1880s that survived in the Shabbatian world. We think that maybe the Holocaust actually killed the last of the Shabbatians. We don't even know for sure, because part of what is true about them is they don't tell people they're Shabbatians. It's part of their religion to hide their religion. And so the Shabbatian movement is going to continue to function, and the Shabbatians will end in Turkey right now. That religion might still be alive. The issue is we don't know that it's extinct. But I will tell you that I have a family, and she said that her family, her grandfather, had continued belief as a Shabbatian, but that his parents didn't. Her parents didn't. but she knew that she came from a family that believed in Shabbatites. That was part of their family history. And I asked her, are the Shabbatians left in Turkey? And she said that she had not met any. That she knew of families that were Shabbatian families, but she didn't know of anyone practicing Shabbatianism any longer. So many scholars think that it's gone extinct, but that's up in the air. Because again, part of how the religion operates. So next week what we'll do is we'll talk about the second part of all this. How a basically manic depressive Messiah who died, who converted to another religion and died, managed to give rise to a completely new religion. And that religion, Shabbatianism, actually survived and may even survive up to this day. So we'll talk about that branch off of Kabbalah and how this Kabbalistic stuff had led to the Shabbat Tzvi movement. And if you've ever heard these rules around, you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40 and married, etc., etc., if you've ever heard those rules only emerged after this whole business of Shabbat Tzvi, because of how much of a disaster this was in Jewish history. So the Shabbatian moment actually gives you what's going to pump the brakes on the spread of Kabbalah, because at this point Kabbalah was spreading very rapidly, very publicly. The Shabbat Tzvi episode, the rabbis are going to pump the brakes, because they're going to say, oh, this Kabbalah stuff is very dangerous, it's a disaster. They're going to pump the brakes on it, and it's going to slow the spread of Kabbalah in some ways, but then it's going to give rise to a whole new religion, the religion of the Doneh, the religion of the continued belief in the messiahship of Shabbat Tzvi. So, wrap up Shabbat Tzvi. Welcome back, and thank you for joining the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. If you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, magic, Hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching, where we explore the arcane and history. Is when presidents say